Welcome back to 40 Days with Jesus. As we are making this disciples journey, each day we're looking at different events from the life of Jesus. And today I want to take us to another key event. This time it's the temptation of Jesus. It's the event that immediately followed his baptism. You know, by nature, we tend towards what's the easiest and not what's the hardest or most difficult. It's our tendency, it's a human nature type of thing. We look for the less strenuous path, not the more strenuous. We want to reach out to grab the low-hanging or easily accessible fruit, not the fruit at the top of the tree that's hardest to get to. And most of us, we want to avoid working in the heat of the day, right? We want to work in the cool of the morning or the cooler time of the evening. We tend towards the most convenient, we tend towards the most accessible, and we tend toward the most comfortable. It's always kind of been a part of the human nature to do so, and that tendency is something that Satan works to exploit any way that he can. In fact, we'll see that the devil's temptations of Jesus are also all about offering an easier path, an alternative path to accomplish the mission that Christ has. He wants to offer Jesus, at its very core, something else to follow or someone else to follow than the plan that God has set in place. Like the very first temptation in the Garden of Eden, Satan is once again tempting someone to question what God has said, to take an alternative and disobedient path. Well, as we think about these temptations and we think about what's happening there, this account occurs across three different books of the New Testament. It's recorded in Matthew chapter 4, verses 1 through 11, Mark chapter 1, verses 12 and 13, and we also see it in Luke chapter 4, verses 1 through 13. I'm going to kind of boil those down together for the purpose of our study today, and I want us to think about this challenging circumstance. It tells us that in Mark chapter 1 that at once, that is, as soon as Jesus has been baptized, that immediately the Spirit sends him out into the desert. And I want to say to you that when Jesus gave the model prayer, he said, "Lord, please lead us not into temptation." So he understood what a challenge that this could be. And it wasn't that God tempted Jesus, but he is led into this space where he will be tempted. And so Jesus is led into the desert, and he was in the desert for 40 days. And he was being tempted by Satan along the way. He was with the wild animals. And after fasting for 40 days and 40 nights, Jesus was hungry. He had gone even beyond the limits of what physically what a person can do. Was right there at the edge. And there, in that weakened state, the devil seizes the opportunity. And it says, the devil said to him, "If you are the Son of God." And I just have to say here, right, this is so like Satan. What's he doing here? He's questioning what God had said at the baptism, what we read yesterday. He's questioning that. Yesterday we read those words that when Jesus was baptized and he came up out of the water, that God said the words, "This is my beloved Son, in him I am well pleased." And now, while yesterday we saw that baptism pleased God, and that it was at the baptism that God declared Jesus is my Son, now in the desert, Satan is saying, well, if you are, then do these things. If you are the Son of God, then prove it by telling this stone to become bread. But Jesus answers him, and I want you to note that everything that Jesus uses to respond to Satan, he uses references to Scripture. He says, well, Satan, man doesn't live by bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God. Then the devil led him, it says, to a high place. He showed him in an instant all the kingdoms of the world. Matthew tells us he showed him their splendor. And he said to Jesus, I will give you all their authority and splendor, for it has been given to me. And I can give it to anyone I want to. So, if you worship me, it will all be yours. Again, Jesus answers them and he says, worship the Lord your God and serve him only. Then the devil took him to the holy city. He had him stand on the highest point of the temple. And again he said, if you are the Son of God, throw yourself down. For it is written, God will command his angels concerning you, and they will lift you up in their hands, so that you will not strike your foot against a stone. And Jesus answered him, it is also written, do not put the Lord your God to the test. When the devil had finished tempting him, he left him until a more opportune time. And then angels came and attended to Jesus. From Jesus' temptation in this story, we can learn a lot about the disciples' journey. First of all, we can learn it's a dangerous thing to follow Jesus, and it may involve intense spiritual battles. We probably won't always feel good, and we'll experience times of deprivation and loneliness and even a kind of hostility. Jesus' temptations also show us that our spiritual victories may not always be visible to a watching world. And above all, it shows us that we must use the power of God to face temptation and not try to withstand it in our own strength. Isn't it something how the devil spins those temptations? Why suffer and hunger any longer? Use your power to benefit yourself. Turn the stones to bread. And he had said, why put so much effort into saving the world? Just bow down and worship me. It'll all be yours. And the clincher, really. Why succumb to pain and torture or death? All the people really needs a sign, a powerful sign. Jump off the temple and let them all see it happen. When the angels grab hold of you, they'll believe. And Satan was implying you'll be king of Jerusalem by the end of the day and king of the world shortly thereafter. Like a dishwasher salesman, promising an easier way of life, an easier cleanup after dinner, Satan smoothly calls Jesus to the broad and easy path. But that path, friends, is tragically a path that leads to destruction. And it's a path that way too many walk today. By contrast, God's path is narrow. At times, it's difficult. God's plan calls for serving instead of being served. It calls for sacrificing instead of receiving. And it calls for following instead of leading or going wherever we want. Is that path an easy one to walk? Absolutely not. Jesus would later remind those on the narrow path that in this world you'll have trouble. But he told them, take heart. I have overcome the world. It reminds me of what the Hebrew writer wrote in Hebrews chapter 4, verse 15. He said, we do not have a high priest who's unable to sympathize with our weaknesses. We have one who's been tempted in every way, just as we are. Yet he is without sin. So let us approach the throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. Paul the Apostle wrote about temptation, understanding what had happened, these words that also reference, I think, the temptation of Jesus. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13, the Apostle Paul tells us that there is no temptation which has overtaken us, except for the types of temptations that are common to all people. They're not super temptations that we can't handle. And he goes on to write that God is faithful and that he will not allow us to be tempted with more than we can bear. In fact, with any temptation, he promises he'll provide a way of escape so that we will be able to endure. That's quite a promise. I often have said that too often we look for ways into temptation when we should be looking for the way out that God is providing. And God always provides a way of escape. You know, there can be no doubt that Satan, as he tempts Jesus and as he is trying to undermine the journey ahead for Jesus, he's already showing us he's nervous. What's God doing? I want to remind you of something. While Satan is very real, and he has real power, and is not something or someone to be taken lightly, God's power is infinitely greater than Satan's power. And I encourage you always to seek God's way and God's path. It is the path that leads to life. And be on your guard. For our adversary prowls about us like a roaring lion, a beast that desires to tear us to pieces. He came to kill, steal, and destroy, not to give life. I encourage you, as you move forward, follow Christ. Follow his example. He's the one who will help us in this journey. God be with you as you continue to walk with him across this 40-day journey.